him, I said, look, because of what has happened, I don't think it is appropriate that we should remain in contact. And by mutual agreement.
Something shocking just emerged about Prince Andrew that nobody saw coming. Financial documents he thought were safely hidden have been discovered by an investigative journalist, and the palace is scrambling into emergency damage control. These aren't just any records. They show years of secret financial activity that Andrew never disclosed to anyone, not even his own family. Now, authorities are getting involved, and Andrew is finding himself completely isolated, with no one willing to defend him this time. What could possibly be in those financial records that's causing this level of panic? And how did Andrew manage to keep these secrets hidden for so long? The discovery that sparked a crisis. The financial records that would ignite the most severe crisis Prince Andrew had faced in years surfaced at 11:43 on the morning of Friday, November 29, 2025. An investigative journalist working for a major British newspaper, reviewing documents related to offshore financial structures, stumbled across a series of transactions that included a name she immediately recognized. The discovery was accidental in the sense that she had not been specifically investigating Andrew, but once she noticed the connection, she began pulling threads with the systematic thoroughness that characterized her 2 decades of investigative work. By early afternoon, the journalist had assembled enough material to understand she had uncovered something significant. The documents showed financial movements involving Andrew that had never been publicly disclosed, transactions spanning from 2020 through 2025, totaling amounts far larger than could be explained by his known income sources. She contacted Buckingham Palace's press office at 3:17 that afternoon, providing a brief summary of what she had found and requesting comment before publication. The palace's reaction was immediate and bordered on panic. The press officer who received the initial call escalated the matter within minutes to the most senior communications officials, who recognized instantly that this was not a routine inquiry that could be managed with standard deflection. By 4 o'clock, an emergency meeting had been convened, including the King's private secretary, the palace's senior legal advisor, and the head of communications. All three understood that if the journalist's information was accurate, they were facing a scandal that could dwarf Andrew's previous controversies. What made these financial records different from previous scandals involving Andrew was the nature of the evidence. The Epstein connections, damaging as they were, had involved associations and behavior that Andrew could dispute or contextualize, claiming misunderstanding or innocent explanations. His previous financial troubles, while embarrassing, had been framed as debt and poor judgment rather than active deception. But documented financial transactions, official records showing money flowing from specific sources to accounts linked to Andrew, these could not be easily explained away or dismissed as misinterpretation. The scale of what Andrew had been hiding became clearer as palace officials began their own urgent review of whatever information they could access. Initial assessments suggested the undisclosed financial activity totaled somewhere between £8 million and £12 million over a 5-year period. That was not simply unreported income. It was a parallel financial existence that Andrew had maintained while publicly claiming to have stepped back from business activities and severed problematic relationships. The discrepancy between his public statements and documented reality was stark and deeply troubling. By early evening, King Charles had been fully briefed on the situation. The documents the journalist had obtained appeared legitimate, cross-referenced with known financial institutions and corroborated by independent records. Palace lawyers confirmed that if the information became public, it would be virtually impossible to deny or significantly challenge. Andrew had been receiving substantial undisclosed payments from sources he had publicly claimed to have no ongoing relationship with, and he had structured these arrangements in ways that suggested deliberate concealment rather than innocent oversight. The palace's options for managing the crisis were limited and unappealing. They could attempt to get ahead of the story by releasing information proactively, but that risked amplifying a scandal that might otherwise receive less attention. They could prepare defensive statements emphasizing that everything was legal even if undisclosed, but that approach would not address the fundamental issue of deception and hidden relationships. or they could brace for publication and deal with the fallout reactively, which experience suggested would be the worst possible approach. Charles's initial reaction, according to those who briefed him, was not the measured concern one might expect from a monarch accustomed to family scandals. It was anger, sharp and immediate, directed at Andrew for creating yet another crisis through behavior that combined arrogance, poor judgment, and apparent dishonesty. The king had spent years managing the fallout from Andrew's various scandals, had made difficult decisions about removing his brother from public life, and had believed that chapter was largely closed. Now it was exploding open again with revelations that suggested Andrew had learned nothing and had continued problematic behavior while hiding it from family and institution alike. As evening turned to night on November 29th, the palace prepared for a story that would break within days. The journalist had indicated she needed time to finalize verification and prepare her article, giving the palace perhaps 48 to 72 hours before publication. That narrow window would be used for desperate attempts at damage control, family confrontations, and preparations for what everyone understood would be devastating public reaction. What the records actually show. The financial records that the investigative journalist had uncovered painted a picture of Prince Andrew's hidden financial life that was far more extensive and troubling than even pessimistic palace officials had initially feared. As more details emerged through the journalist's continued investigation and the palace's own internal review, the full scope of what Andrew had been concealing became impossible to ignore or minimize. The undisclosed payments totaled approximately £11.3 million over the 5-year period from January 2020 through October 2025. These were not small, easily overlooked transactions, but substantial transfers, often in amounts of several £100,000 at a time, flowing through a network of accounts and financial structures specifically designed to obscure their origin and destination. The money had come from at least 7 different sources, all of which raised serious questions about Andrew's judgment, honesty, and potential ongoing entanglements with problematic individuals and organizations. The largest single source of undisclosed income, accounting for approximately £4.2 million, was a business entity registered in the British Virgin Islands with connections to a wealthy businessman. Andrew had publicly claimed to have ceased all association with following the Epstein scandal. That businessman, while not directly implicated in Epstein's crimes, had been part of the same social and business circles, and Andrew's continued financial relationship with him directly contradicted statements made to palace officials and in public communications that all such connections had been severed. A second significant source, totaling roughly £2.8 million, traced back to a Middle Eastern entity that had previously employed Andrew as a trade representative. While that arrangement had been somewhat known, the records revealed that payments had continued well beyond the publicly disclosed end date of the relationship, suggesting either that Andrew had misrepresented when the arrangement concluded or that he had received additional undisclosed compensation after the official relationship ended. Either scenario represented a significant discrepancy between public statements and documented reality. Additional payments, in amounts ranging from £300,000 to £800,000, had come from sources including a Monaco-based investment fund, a property development company in Switzerland, and a consulting firm in Luxembourg. In each case, the records showed that Andrew had received money from entities he had claimed no active relationship with, or had failed to disclose financial connections that any reasonable person would recognize as requiring transparency given his position. What made the timeline particularly damaging was that many of these payments had occurred after Andrew's disastrous BBC interview in November of 2019, after his supposed stepping back from public duties, and even after his settlement with Virginia Giuffre in 2022. He had been receiving substantial undisclosed income during the very period when he was publicly portraying himself as having retreated from business activities, severed problematic relationships, and focused on supporting the monarchy in non-public ways. The documented reality was that he had maintained an active, lucrative, and carefully hidden financial life throughout this supposedly quiet period. But how was he able to hide all of these years? How Andrew kept this hidden? The financial structures Prince Andrew had used to conceal £11.3 million in undisclosed income over 5 years demonstrated a level of sophistication that suggested professional assistance and deliberate intent to avoid scrutiny. As investigators and palace officials worked to understand how Andrew had maintained these secrets for so long, a complex picture emerged of offshore accounts, layered corporate entities, and legal arrangements specifically designed to obscure money trails and shield transactions from the kind of transparency typically expected of senior royals. The foundation of Andrew's concealment strategy rested on a network of offshore accounts, primarily in the British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, and Switzerland. These jurisdictions, while not inherently improper for financial holdings, offered privacy protections that made tracking money movements difficult without specific legal authority to pierce corporate veils and access confidential banking records. Andrew had established or gained access to at least 6 separate accounts across these jurisdictions, each used for different streams of income and structured to avoid obvious connections to his identity. The accounts were not held directly in Andrew's name, which would have been easily discoverable. Instead, they were registered to various corporate entities and trusts, with Andrew's beneficial interest buried beneath layers of nominees, corporate directors, and legal structures that required significant investigative resources to unravel. One particularly complex arrangement involved a British Virgin Islands company that owned a Swiss trust, which in turn held accounts in the Cayman Islands, with Andrew's interest in the structure documented only through confidential legal agreements held by a law firm in Liechtenstein. The sophistication of these arrangements made clear that Andrew had not constructed them alone or without professional guidance. Investigators identified at least 3 individuals who appeared to have played roles in helping Andrew maintain his hidden financial life. The first was a private banker based in Geneva who had handled several of the Swiss accounts and who specialized in what the banking industry delicately termed privacy-focused wealth management for high-net-worth individuals, concerned about discretion. The second was a British accountant who had worked with Andrew since the early 2000s and who had apparently maintained dual sets of records, one showing Andrew's publicly disclosed income and financial situation, and another documenting the fuller reality, including offshore receipts and undisclosed payments. That accountant, when contacted by investigators, initially claimed attorney-client privilege and confidentiality obligations, though legal experts noted that such protections would not extend to facilitating deception or illegal activity if any such activity were ultimately proven. The third key figure was a lawyer specializing in offshore corporate structures who had apparently designed many of the layered entities and trusts that Andrew used. This individual, based in the Channel Islands, had a practice focused on serving wealthy clients seeking to minimize tax obligations and maximize privacy, operating entirely within legal boundaries, but pushing those boundaries to their limits in terms of disclosure, avoidance, and asset concealment. The question of what palace officials knew or suspected about Andrew's hidden financial activities was particularly sensitive and potentially explosive. A thorough review suggested that senior palace staff had likely not known the full extent of Andrew's offshore arrangements or undisclosed income. However, there had been warning signs and anomalies that might have prompted deeper investigation if anyone had been paying close enough attention or had sufficient cause to push past Andrew's reassurances. In 2021, during discussions about Royal Lodge funding, a junior financial officer at the palace had noted that Andrew's claimed inability to cover certain expenses seemed inconsistent with his known lifestyle and expenditures. That observation had been raised with a more senior official, who had apparently accepted Andrew's explanation that he was receiving help from Sarah Ferguson and their daughters without probing further. In retrospect, that moment represented a missed opportunity to discover the hidden income streams. Similarly, in 2022, during the settlement negotiations with Virginia Giuffre, questions had been raised about exactly how Andrew would fund his portion of the settlement. The figures discussed seemed to require resources beyond what he claimed to possess, and there had been some confusion about whether he was receiving money from the Queen, from Charles, or from other sources. That confusion might have prompted deeper investigation, But in the urgency of reaching a settlement and the sensitivity of the situation, the questions had been set aside. Why the concealment finally failed came down to a combination of factors that converged in late 2025. The primary cause was the investigative journalist's accidental discovery while researching an unrelated story about offshore financial structures. She had been examining leaked documents from a British Virgin Islands corporate registry, looking for connections to a different subject entirely, when Andrew's name appeared in connection with one of the shell companies. That chance discovery led to months of painstaking investigation, cross-referencing multiple databases and financial records, eventually assembling a comprehensive picture of Andrew's hidden finances. But the concealment had also begun failing because some of the protective structures Andrew relied on were becoming less secure, as international pressure increased on tax havens and offshore jurisdictions to provide greater transparency. New regulations requiring beneficial ownership disclosure, data sharing agreements between countries, and increased scrutiny of suspicious transactions had made maintaining complete financial secrecy more difficult even in traditionally protective jurisdictions. Andrew's arrangements, constructed mostly in the late 2010s, were becoming vulnerable to enforcement mechanisms that had strengthened significantly by 2025. Charles's explosive reaction. King Charles learned about the exposed financial records at 8:37 on the morning of Saturday, November 30th, during what was supposed to be a routine briefing with his private secretary at Clarence House. The king had been expecting updates on the upcoming week's schedule and preparations for Christmas at Sandringham. Instead, he received a comprehensive summary of what the investigative journalist had discovered and what palace officials had been able to verify through their own urgent inquiries over the past 18 hours. Charles's initial response was silence, the kind of profound quiet that his staff had learned to recognize as far more dangerous than immediate anger. He read through the summary document twice, his expression growing progressively darker, before setting it down on his desk with deliberate care and asking in a voice that was controlled but barely how long his private secretary had known about this. The answer, that the information had only reached senior palace officials the previous afternoon, did little to soften the king's fury. What drove Charles's rage was not simply the discovery that Andrew had hidden millions in income and maintained problematic financial relationships. It was the accumulation of deception, the recognition that Andrew had been lying to him repeatedly over years, while Charles had been using his own resources and political capital to protect and support his brother. Charles had helped fund Andrew's legal settlement, had provided financial assistance when Andrew claimed he could not afford Royal Lodge expenses, had defended him within the family when others argued for harsher consequences. All of it based on Andrew's representations of his financial situation that were now proven to be comprehensively false. By 10 o'clock that morning, Charles had demanded that Andrew come to Clarence House immediately for a conversation. Andrew, who was at Royal Lodge and had been informed overnight that the financial records exposure was imminent, arrived shortly after 11:30. What followed was a confrontation that staff working in adjacent areas of Clarence House later described as the most intense family argument they had witnessed during Charles's reign. The conversation was not overheard in detail, both men being behind closed doors in Charles's private study, but the raised voices were unmistakable. Charles's anger was audible through the heavy doors, his words indistinct, but his tone carrying a fury that made staff members exchange uncomfortable glances and find reasons to work in parts of the building farther from the study. Andrew's voice was also occasionally audible, defensive, and increasingly desperate as the confrontation continued. The meeting lasted approximately 40 minutes, and when Andrew emerged, his face was ashen, his usual blustering confidence completely absent. He left Clarence House without speaking to any staff, moving quickly to his car as though eager to escape. Charles did not emerge from his study for another 20 minutes, and when he did, those who saw him reported that he looked exhausted and profoundly disappointed rather than still actively angry. The rage had burned through, leaving behind something colder and more final. Charles's realization during that confrontation was one he later articulated to his private secretary. Trust was completely broken, not strained, not damaged, but shattered beyond any possibility of repair. Andrew had looked him in the eye repeatedly over the past several years and lied about his financial situation, his business relationships, and his activities. He had accepted help and support under false pretenses. He had made promises about changing his behavior that he had no intention of keeping. And most damningly, he had continued the very activities and associations that had caused his disgrace, simply hiding them better while publicly claiming rehabilitation. What Andrew had apparently tried to argue during the confrontation, that everything he had done was technically legal, that the offshore arrangements were standard wealth management, that he had not explicitly lied so much as failed to volunteer information, these justifications only deepened Charles's fury. The king did not care about technical legality. He cared that Andrew had fundamentally deceived him while accepting his protection and support, and had exposed the monarchy to further scandal through behavior that demonstrated complete lack of judgment or remorse. The moment Charles decided Andrew had gone too far came not during the confrontation itself, but in the hours afterward, as he processed what had been revealed and what it meant. By early evening on November 30th, Charles had reached a conclusion he communicated to his most senior advisors. Andrew would be cut off completely. No more financial support, no more institutional protection, no more tolerance or second chances. The repeated pattern of scandal, apology, promises to reform, and then further scandal had to end because Andrew had proven conclusively that he would not change and could not be trusted. Charles recognized this decision would be painful and would likely generate public controversy. Andrew was his brother, and completely severing financial support would leave Andrew in a genuinely difficult position. But the alternative, continuing to extend support and tolerance to someone who had so thoroughly betrayed trust and continued to expose the monarchy to reputational damage, was no longer acceptable. The institution had to matter more than family loyalty, especially when that family loyalty was being exploited rather than honored. William and Anne's united response. The emergency family meeting convened at Windsor Castle at 2 o'clock on the afternoon of Sunday, December 1st, gathering the senior royals who would need to agree on how to respond to Andrew's exposed financial records. Present were King Charles, Prince William, Princess Anne, and 2 senior advisors whose presence was deemed necessary given the legal and communications complexities involved. The atmosphere as participants assembled was grim, everyone understanding that the decisions made in this meeting would define Andrew's future and potentially affect the monarchy's credibility during a period when it could afford no additional scandals. William spoke first after Charles provided a summary of what was known and what Andrew had said during their confrontation the previous day. The Prince of Wales, who had long argued for firmer action regarding his uncle, made his position explicit and uncompromising. Andrew must be completely cut off from all royal support, financial or otherwise. There could be no half measures, no gradual distancing, no leaving room for future rehabilitation. The pattern of scandal and concealment had proven that Andrew was incapable of reform and represented an ongoing threat to the institution's credibility. William emphasized that this was not simply about punishing Andrew for past behavior. It was about protecting the monarchy's future from someone who had demonstrated repeatedly that he would continue engaging in problematic activities regardless of consequences or commitments made to family. The exposed financial records proved that Andrew had learned nothing from his previous scandals, had deceived those trying to help him, and had prioritized his own interests over institutional well-being. Continuing to maintain any connection to him would make the monarchy complicit in whatever future scandals he generated. Princess Anne's agreement with William's position surprised no one who knew her, but the firmness of her statement carried weight, given her decades of service and her historical relationship with Andrew. She pointed out that the monarchy survived by maintaining public trust and demonstrating that it held its members to appropriate standards. Andrew's behavior over the past 5 years, now documented through financial records that could not be disputed or explained away, showed complete disregard for those standards. Continuing to tolerate him would signal that royal family members faced no real consequences for deception and poor judgment. Anne also raised practical concerns that extended beyond immediate scandal management. If Andrew had maintained hidden offshore accounts and undisclosed income streams, What guarantee was there that he did not have other secrets still concealed? The institution could not continue subsidizing someone who had repeatedly betrayed its trust simply because that person happened to be the king's brother. The consensus that emerged over the 2-hour meeting was clear and unanimous. Andrew would be informed that all royal financial support would cease immediately. He would need to vacate Royal Lodge within a reasonable time frame, likely 6 months, as the property could no longer be made available to someone completely severed from institutional support. Any remaining nominal titles or courtesies that had survived his previous scandals would be reviewed for removal. And most significantly, the family would not defend him or provide cover if legal authorities decided to pursue investigations into his financial arrangements. William insisted on one additional element that Charles accepted with visible reluctance. The palace would not only cut off support but would make the reasons for doing so clear in public communication. The days of protecting royal family members through vague statements and diplomatic language had to end. The public deserved to know that Andrew was being removed because he had deceived his family and maintained hidden financial relationships that contradicted his public statements. Without that clarity, the decision would appear weak or arbitrary rather than principled and necessary. As the meeting concluded, the participants understood they had made decisions that would reverberate through both the royal family and public consciousness. They were not simply disciplining Andrew for specific transgressions. They were establishing a precedent that no one, regardless of birth or relationship to the crown, could repeatedly betray institutional trust without facing complete and final consequences. The legal and political fallout. Within 24 hours of the financial records exposure becoming known to palace officials, 3 separate government authorities had initiated reviews of Prince Andrew's financial arrangements, responding both to the documented evidence and to rapidly building public and political pressure for official investigation. His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, the UK's tax authority, was the first to act, opening a formal inquiry into whether Andrew had properly reported and paid taxes on the millions in offshore income revealed in the exposed records. The tax implications alone were potentially severe. If Andrew had failed to report income totaling £11.3 million over 5 years, the unpaid taxes could amount to several million pounds depending on the nature of the income and applicable rates. More seriously, if authorities determined that the failure to report had been deliberate rather than inadvertent, Andrew could face not just financial penalties but potential criminal prosecution for tax evasion, a charge that carried possible imprisonment for serious cases. The National Crime Agency, Britain's equivalent of the FBI, also announced it would review the exposed records to determine whether any of Andrew's financial arrangements warranted investigation under money laundering statutes. While having offshore accounts was not inherently illegal, the complex structures Andrew had used to receive and conceal income from certain sources raised questions about whether proper due diligence had been conducted on the origins of funds and whether the arrangements had been designed, specifically to avoid scrutiny that might have revealed problematic connections. The third authority taking interest was the Charity Commission, which oversaw non-profit organizations in the UK. Several of the entities that had made payments to Andrew had claimed charitable status or had connections to charitable foundations. If those entities had been paying Andrew for services or access while maintaining tax-advantaged charitable registration, it could constitute misuse of charitable structures for personal benefit, a matter the Commission took very seriously given public trust in the charitable sector. The potential legal consequences Andrew faced extended beyond British authorities. Some of the offshore jurisdictions where he had maintained accounts and received payments had their own disclosure requirements and anti-money laundering regulations. If Andrew had misrepresented his activities or the source of funds to financial institutions in those jurisdictions, he could theoretically face legal exposure there as well, though practical prosecution across international boundaries would be complex and unlikely unless British authorities specifically sought assistance. Political pressure on King Charles to take definitive action intensified rapidly as news of the exposed financial records spread through Westminster. Multiple members of Parliament from various parties issued statements expressing concern and calling for accountability. The language used was carefully calibrated to avoid direct criticism of the monarchy itself, but the message was clear. Parliament and the public expected the royal family to demonstrate that no one was above scrutiny and that deceptive financial behavior would not be tolerated regardless of family connections. The leader of the opposition used Prime Minister's questions on December 4th to raise the matter, asking what discussions the government had held with the palace regarding the Andrew situation and what assurances could be provided that appropriate authorities were investigating thoroughly. The Prime Minister's response emphasized that investigations were independent of political influence but confirmed that the government expected all citizens, including members of the royal family, to comply fully with financial disclosure requirements and tax obligations. Behind closed doors, the political pressure was even more direct. Senior government officials conveyed to palace representatives that this scandal was creating significant political discomfort at a time when the government faced other challenges and could not afford extended controversy about royal family financial impropriety. The clear implication was that decisive palace action removing Andrew completely from any royal association would be welcomed and would help contain political fallout. International implications emerged as well, particularly regarding some of the sources of Andrew's undisclosed income. The Middle Eastern entity that had continued paying him after their official relationship supposedly ended had connections to a government regime whose human rights record had been criticized by international observers. Andrew's continued financial relationship with that entity, while claiming to have stepped back from such connections, created diplomatic awkwardness, particularly as the British government had been attempting to balance commercial relationships with that region against human rights concerns. Similarly, one of the European sources of Andrew's income had connections to business interests that had been subjects of corruption investigations in their home countries, though no definitive wrongdoing had been proven. The association between a senior British royal and individuals or entities under corruption scrutiny, even if Andrew's specific transactions were legal, created reputational problems that extended beyond Britain's borders and affected how the monarchy was perceived internationally. Why this scandal potentially exceeded even the Epstein connections in terms of institutional damage came down to the nature of the evidence and the pattern it revealed. The Epstein scandal had been horrific in its subject matter, but Andrew had been able to claim, however unconvincingly, that he had been unaware of the extent of Epstein's crimes and that his association had been a terrible error in judgment. The financial records, by contrast, showed deliberate, systematic deception maintained over years, involving millions of pounds and carefully constructed concealment mechanisms. This was not a mistake or an error in judgment. This was calculated behavior designed specifically to hide activities Andrew knew would be controversial, maintained while he was accepting help and support from family members he was actively deceiving. The financial records proved beyond dispute that Andrew had learned nothing from previous scandals and had simply become more sophisticated at hiding his behavior rather than changing it. That revelation, documented through his own financial transactions, was in some ways more damaging than allegations from external sources because it came directly from Andrew's own choices and actions, recorded in financial systems he had believed were secure from scrutiny. Andrew's desperate attempts at explanation. Prince Andrew's initial response to the exposure of his hidden financial records, articulated through a statement released by his legal team on the evening of December 1st, claimed that everything he had done was entirely legal and that he had complied with all applicable disclosure requirements. The statement emphasized that maintaining offshore financial structures was common practice among individuals with international business interests, and that Andrew had received professional, legal, and accounting advice throughout the period in question. The tone was defensive but attempted to project confidence that scrutiny would vindicate his conduct. The problem with Andrew's legal defense was that it addressed the wrong question. While he might technically have stayed within legal boundaries, the issue was not purely about legality but about honesty, judgment, and the trust he had violated. The statement made no mention of why he had concealed these arrangements from his family, why he had claimed financial hardship while receiving millions in undisclosed income, or why he had maintained relationships with individuals and entities he had supposedly severed ties with after previous scandals. Andrew's attempts to contact King Charles directly to explain context and provide his version of events began on December 2nd and continued over the following days with increasing desperation. He made at least 7 calls to Charles's private secretary requesting a meeting, sent multiple detailed letters attempting to explain the financial arrangements and why they were not as problematic as they appeared, and even attempted to approach Charles directly during a Sunday service at Windsor when both were present, an attempt that was politely but firmly blocked by security staff acting on clear instructions. The substance of Andrew's explanations, as conveyed through his letters and messages, centered on several key arguments. He claimed that the offshore accounts had been established for legitimate tax planning purposes on advice of professionals, and that their existence had been properly disclosed to relevant authorities, even if not publicly announced. He argued that the continued payments from various sources represented completion of earlier agreements and consulting relationships rather than new or ongoing improper connections. And he maintained that he had never explicitly lied to Charles or other family members, but rather had not volunteered detailed financial information because it was private and not directly relevant to family discussions. The family's rejection of these justifications was complete and unambiguous. Charles refused all of Andrew's requests for meetings, conveying through intermediaries that there was nothing Andrew could say that would change the fundamental reality of his deception and poor judgment. William, when informed of Andrew's attempts to explain and defend his conduct, reportedly stated that the time for explanations had passed, and that Andrew's continued refusal to accept responsibility for his behavior only reinforced the correctness of the decision to sever all ties. Princess Anne's response to Andrew's justifications was characteristically blunt. When shown excerpts from one of his letters attempting to provide context for the offshore arrangements, she reportedly observed that Andrew's explanations were not defenses but rather confirmations of exactly the kind of entitled, consequence-free thinking that had created the problem in the first place. The fact that he still believed he could explain away systematic concealment with technical legal arguments demonstrated he fundamentally did not understand what he had done wrong. Sarah Ferguson's position as these revelations emerged was complicated and became a subject of intense speculation. She had remained at Royal Lodge throughout Andrew's scandals, maintaining what she described as a supportive friendship despite their decades-old divorce. However, the financial records exposure created new pressure on her to distance herself from Andrew or risk her own reputation being further damaged by association. By early December, sources close to Sarah indicated she was deeply troubled by the revelations, particularly the evidence that Andrew had concealed millions in income while she had been publicly defending him and claiming he was struggling financially. Sarah's daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, found themselves in the painful position of watching their father face complete familial and institutional rejection. Both had maintained close relationships with Andrew despite his scandals, and both now had to navigate the tension between loyalty to their father and recognition that his behavior had been indefensible. Neither made public statements, but both were reported to have had difficult private conversations with Andrew, urging him to stop trying to explain or justify his conduct and instead accept responsibility and the consequences that followed. Andrew's realization that he was completely isolated now came gradually through December as each attempt to reach family members or explain his position was rebuffed. What happens to Andrew now? The permanent severing of all financial support from Prince Andrew was formalized through a series of legal notifications delivered during the second week of December 2025. The documents, prepared by palace solicitors and reviewed by the King's private secretary, made clear that effective January 1, 2026, Andrew would no longer receive any funds from the sovereign grant, any income from Duchy of Lancaster holdings traditionally allocated to support extended family members, or any personal financial assistance from King Charles. The termination was absolute and carried no provision for reconsideration or review. The immediate practical implication was that Andrew's ability to maintain his current lifestyle ended abruptly. His residence at Royal Lodge, which he had occupied since 2004, came with annual maintenance costs estimated at £400,000, costs that had been covered through a combination of rental payments Andrew made at below-market rates and direct palace subsidies when his payments fell short. Without royal support, Andrew had no realistic means of covering those costs from his known legitimate income sources, though the exposed offshore income suggested he might have hidden resources if he could access them despite the scrutiny now focused on his finances. The palace's formal notice regarding Royal Lodge gave Andrew until June 30th, 2026, to vacate the property. 6 months was deemed sufficient time to find alternative accommodation while avoiding the appearance of cruel or precipitous eviction. However, the message was unambiguous that extensions would not be granted, and that if Andrew failed to leave voluntarily by the deadline, formal legal proceedings would be initiated to compel his departure. The Crown property would be reassigned, possibly to working royals, possibly for other purposes, but definitely without Andrew. Potential removal of remaining titles and privileges became a matter of intense legal and constitutional review during December. Andrew had already lost his military appointments and royal patronages following the Epstein scandal and his disastrous BBC interview. His HRH styling had been removed from active use, though technically remained his by birth. The question now was whether additional formal action should be taken to strip remaining vestiges of royal status, particularly the Duke of York title he had held since his wedding in 1986. Removing a peerage title was constitutionally complex, traditionally requiring an act of parliament given that such titles were considered property rights with legal protections. However, palace officials were quietly exploring whether parliamentary appetite existed for such action, given the severity of Andrew's revealed financial deceptions. The precedent of removing titles from disgraced nobility had historical examples, but none in recent decades involving someone so close to the direct line of succession, even though Andrew himself was now 8th in line and unlikely to ever become king. Where Andrew would actually live after leaving Royal Lodge remained uncertain through December. His known assets included no other properties, and his ability to rent or purchase accommodation commensurate with his previous lifestyle depended entirely on accessing funds from sources that were now under intense scrutiny. Some speculation centered on the possibility of Andrew moving abroad, perhaps to a jurisdiction where he might face less intense public recognition and media attention. Though any such move would require financial resources, he might struggle to deploy without triggering further investigation. How Andrew would survive financially going forward presented genuine questions despite the millions in offshore income that had been exposed. Those funds, now documented and under investigation, could not be easily accessed or spent without explaining their origins and legitimacy. If tax authorities determined Andrew owed substantial back taxes and penalties, his hidden resources might be largely consumed by settling those obligations. His legitimate income sources had never been sufficient to support the lifestyle he had maintained, which was why he had apparently constructed the offshore arrangements in the first place. The possibility of legal prosecution, while uncertain, remained very real as December progressed. Tax authorities had indicated their investigation would take months to complete, but early indications suggested they had found discrepancies between Andrew's reported income and his documented offshore receipts that would be difficult to explain as innocent errors. If prosecutors determined the evidence supported criminal charges for tax evasion, Andrew could face trial and potentially imprisonment, outcomes that would represent an unprecedented scandal for a member of the immediate royal family in modern times. Even if criminal prosecution was avoided, Andrew faced the likelihood of substantial civil penalties and forced payment of back taxes with interest. Legal experts consulted by media organizations estimated he could owe between £3 million and £5 million in unpaid taxes, if authorities determined his offshore income should have been reported and taxed in the UK. Without access to his hidden funds to pay such obligations, Andrew might face bankruptcy, a status that would carry its own legal consequences, including restrictions on his activities and management of any remaining assets. Why this financial scandal might finally end Andrew's story, in a way that even the Epstein connections had not fully accomplished, came down to the nature of the evidence and the impossibility of rehabilitation. The Epstein scandal had been horrific, but had involved allegations and associations that Andrew could dispute or claim not to have fully understood. This scandal was different. It was documented in financial records that Andrew himself had created, showing years of deliberate concealment and deception. There was no one else to blame, no context that could excuse the behavior, no path to claiming misunderstanding or poor advice. The royal family had made clear through both private communication and public signals that this time there would be no eventual rehabilitation, no quiet return after years of lying low, no gradual restoration of status or support. Andrew had exhausted every reserve of family loyalty and institutional tolerance. At 65 years old, he faced the remainder of his life as a disgraced exile from the family and institution that had defined his entire existence. With diminishing resources, mounting legal troubles, and no realistic path back to anything resembling his former position. For a man who had spent 6 decades as His Royal Highness Prince Andrew, Duke of York, that future represented a fall so complete that even he might finally understand the consequences of his choices.